My boss fired me for being pregnant. I had proof and took down the entire company. My boss fired me 3 days after I told him I was pregnant, said I wasn't committed to the company anymore and my position was being eliminated. Except I'd been recording our conversations for months because I knew something like this was coming. And what started as me fighting for my own job ended with taking down an entire company, exposing years of illegal discrimination, and walking away with a settlement that changed my life. Let me tell you exactly how one illegal termination brought down a multi-million-dollar operation. I need to give you some background about the company and my boss because this didn't come out of nowhere. There was a pattern, and I'd been watching it for 2 years. I worked at a marketing firm, mid-sized company, about 150 employees, did digital marketing and brand consulting for corporate clients. I was hired as a senior marketing strategist 3 years ago when I was 27. The pay was good, the work was interesting, and at first, everything seemed fine. My boss's name was Greg. He was the vice president of operations, which meant he oversaw about 60 people, including me. Greg was 48, married with 3 kids, and presented himself as this family-friendly, progressive leader. He had photos of his kids in his office. He talked about his wife constantly. He seemed like a decent guy. But about 6 months into my job, I started noticing things. There were very few women in leadership positions at the company. The executive team was 7 people, all men. The next level down, directors and VPs, was maybe 20% women. And below that, in the manager and specialist roles where I worked, it was closer to 50-50. But women didn't seem to move up. I watched 2 different women on my team, both incredibly talented, both with more experience than me, get passed over for promotions that went to less qualified men. When I asked my coworker Shauna about it, she just shrugged and said, "That's how it is here. Women don't advance past a certain point." Then I started noticing the pregnant women. In the 2 years I'd been there, 4 women on my floor had gotten pregnant. All 4 of them either quit or were laid off before going on maternity leave. The first one, Jessica, announced her pregnancy at 12 weeks. 2 months later, she was let go during a restructuring. Her position was eliminated, but they hired someone new for basically the same role 6 weeks later. The second, Amanda, told HR she was pregnant and was planning to take her full 12 weeks of maternity leave. She was fired 3 weeks later for performance issues, despite having gotten excellent reviews her entire time there. The third, Rochelle, was open about her pregnancy from day one. She was terminated during her second trimester for not being a culture fit anymore. And the fourth, Kennedy, saw the pattern and tried to hide her pregnancy. She made it to 7 months before HR found out. She was laid off 2 weeks later in a department reduction. Her entire department still exists. I wasn't the only one noticing. The women in the office whispered about it. We all saw what was happening. But nobody did anything because we needed our jobs and the company had a reputation in our industry. Getting fired from there looked bad on a resume. People were scared. I told myself I'd be fine because I wasn't planning to get pregnant anytime soon. My husband Owen and I had talked about kids, but we were thinking another few years out. I was focused on my career. But then life happened.
About 8 months ago, I found out I was pregnant. It wasn't planned, we'd been careful, but nothing is 100% effective. When I saw the positive test, my first feeling wasn't joy or excitement. It was fear. I knew what happened to pregnant women at the company. I'd watched it happen 4 times. I told Owen that night. He was happy about the baby, but when I explained the situation at work, he understood my concern. We talked about our options. We had some savings, but not enough for me to be unemployed for long. Owen's job paid decently, but we needed both incomes for our mortgage and bills. I decided I had to try to make it work. Maybe I'd be different. Maybe if I was really careful and didn't let my pregnancy affect my work, they'd have no excuse to fire me. But I also decided I needed insurance. I needed proof of what was happening, just in case. I started documenting everything. I kept a detailed log of my work, projects completed, hours worked, client feedback, everything. I wanted a paper trail showing I was doing my job well. I also started recording conversations. I know in some states you need two-party consent to record, but I live in a one-party consent state. As long as I'm part of the conversation, I can legally record it without telling the other person. I looked this up very carefully to make sure I wasn't breaking any laws. I bought a small recording device that looked like a pen and kept it in my shirt pocket during any meeting with Greg or HR. I also used a recording app on my phone when appropriate. I felt paranoid doing this, but I'd seen what happened to other women. I needed to protect myself. For the first 12 weeks, I didn't tell anyone at work. I was waiting till the pregnancy was more stable, and also I was terrified of what would happen when people found out. But at 13 weeks, I started showing. I couldn't hide it much longer, and legally, I knew I had protections. Pregnancy discrimination is illegal under federal law. They couldn't fire me just because I'm pregnant. Except, I'd watched them do exactly that to 4 other women, so clearly the law wasn't stopping them.
I decided to tell Greg first, before he heard it from someone else. I scheduled a meeting with him, made sure my recording pen was working, and went to his office. Greg, I wanted to let you know that I'm pregnant, I said. I'm about 13 weeks along. Due date is in late March. I'm planning to work up until my due date and then take my maternity leave. Just wanted to give you advance notice for planning purposes. Greg's expression changed immediately. The friendly smile disappeared. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Well, that's quite a surprise. I know it's not ideal timing with the Johnson account ramping up," I said, "but I'm fully committed to seeing that project through. I'll be here for another 6 months before the baby comes, and I'll make sure everything is documented for whoever covers during my leave." "It's not about the Johnson account," Greg said slowly. "It's about commitment to your career. Having a baby changes your priorities. That's just reality." I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my face neutral. "I can assure you that my commitment to my work hasn't changed. I'm still the same employee I was yesterday." "Are you, though?" Greg said. "Because in my experience, once women have kids, they're not really invested in their careers anymore. They're distracted. They leave early for daycare pickups. They take time off when kids are sick. They're just not as dedicated." I couldn't believe he was saying this out loud. But I stayed calm. "I understand your concern, but I can promise you that won't be the case with me. I'm very serious about my career." Greg shook his head. "I've heard that before. They all say that. Then they come back from maternity leave, and 6 months later, they're quitting anyway because they can't handle both. It's a waste of the company's time and resources to invest in someone who's not going to stick around." "That's not fair," I said carefully. "You can't assume I'm going to quit just because I'm having a baby." "I'm not assuming. I'm speaking from experience. This company has invested a lot in you. We've given you opportunities, training, high-profile clients, and now you're going to be focused on diapers and daycare instead of on your work. That's just how it is." "My pregnancy doesn't change my work performance," I said. "I'm still meeting all my deadlines, exceeding my targets, getting great client feedback. Nothing has changed except that I'm having a baby in 6 months." Greg sighed like I was being deliberately difficult. "Look, I'm going to be straight with you. I don't think this is going to work out. You're obviously going to be distracted and less available. We need people who are 100% committed. Maybe it's better if we part ways now before it becomes a bigger issue." My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. "Are you firing me because I'm pregnant?" "I'm not firing you because you're pregnant," Greg said carefully. "I'm saying that your priorities have clearly changed, and this might not be the right fit anymore." "But the only thing that's changed is that I'm pregnant," I said. "My work performance hasn't changed. My commitment hasn't changed. The only new information you have is that I'm having a baby." "Don't put words in my mouth," Greg said, getting irritated. "I'm saying that statistically, women with children are less productive and less committed to their careers. That's not discrimination. That's just facts." "That's
actually the definition of discrimination, I said quietly. Greg stood up. I think we're done here. Why don't you take the rest of the day to think about whether this is really the right place for you right now? We can talk more tomorrow. I left his office shaking, but I had the entire conversation recorded. I went home early and listened to the recording 3 times. Greg had been incredibly clear about his reasoning. He'd explicitly said that he thought pregnant women were less committed, less productive, and that my priorities had changed solely because I was having a baby. That night, Owen and I talked for hours. I played him the recording. He was furious. He said, "That's illegal. That's blatant pregnancy discrimination. You have to report this." I said, "If I report it, I will definitely lose my job. And then we have no income and a baby on the way." "If you don't report it, you'll probably lose your job anyway," Owen pointed out. "You heard what he said. He wants you gone." He was right. I'd seen it happen to the other women. Once they'd been identified as pregnant, it was only a matter of time before they were pushed out. But I had something the other women didn't have. I had recordings. The next day, I went back to work. Greg called me into his office mid-morning. He asked me, "Have you thought about what we discussed yesterday?" I said, "I have. And I want to be clear that I have no intention of quitting. I love this job, and I'm good at it. My pregnancy doesn't change that." Greg frowned. "I was really hoping you'd be reasonable about this." I said, "I think I'm being very reasonable. I'm a good employee who happens to be pregnant. That's not a reason to force me out." "Nobody's forcing you out," Greg said. "But I need to be honest with you about the realities of this situation. We're going into a busy season. We need people who can be here 100%, who can work late when needed, who can travel for client meetings. Can you really do all that while pregnant?" "Yes, I can. I've been doing exactly that for the past 3 months, and you didn't even know I was pregnant." "Well, now I know, and I have to plan accordingly. I can't have someone on my team who I can't rely on." "You can rely on me," I insisted. Greg shook his head. "I don't think I can. And honestly, I think it would be better for everyone if we made this transition now rather than dragging it out. I'm prepared to offer you a severance package. 3 months' salary if you resign by the end of the week. That's generous." "You're asking me to resign because I'm pregnant. I'm offering you a generous severance package because this isn't working out. Take the weekend to think about it." I left that meeting knowing exactly what was happening. They were going to force me out, one way or another. The only question was whether I'd go quietly or fight back. That weekend, I made a decision. I was going to fight.
Monday morning, I went to work as usual. I drafted an email to HR documenting everything Greg had said in both meetings. I attached transcripts of the recordings, which I'd had professionally transcribed to make them easier to read. I explained that I was being discriminated against due to my pregnancy and that I wanted to file a formal complaint. I sent the email to Diane, the head of HR, and copied her assistant and the general HR inbox so there was no way it could get lost. Within 2 hours, I was called into a meeting with Diane and the company's legal counsel, a man named Patrick. They looked extremely uncomfortable. Patrick did most of the talking. "We've received your email and we're taking your allegations very seriously," he said. "However, I need to inform you that recording conversations without consent may not be admissible. I live in a one-party consent state. I've verified that my recordings are completely legal. I'm a party to all the conversations I recorded, which means I don't need anyone else's consent." Patrick's jaw tightened. "Be that as it may, we have policies about recording in the workplace." "Your employee handbook says nothing about recording," I said. I'd checked very carefully. And even if it did, that policy wouldn't override federal employment law. The recordings prove illegal pregnancy discrimination. That's what matters here.
Diane jumped in. Nobody is discriminating against you. Greg has some concerns about your ability to handle your workload while pregnant, which is a legitimate business concern. It's not a legitimate business concern, it's illegal discrimination. Greg explicitly told me that pregnant women are less committed and less productive. He said my priorities had changed solely because I'm having a baby. He offered me severance to resign because, and I quote, "this isn't working out, despite the fact that my work performance has been excellent and nothing has changed except my pregnancy status." I pulled out printed copies of the transcripts. It's all here. Every word. Greg discriminated against me based on my pregnancy. That violates Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. This company is liable. Patrick and Diane exchanged looks. "What is it you want?" Patrick asked finally. "I want to keep my job. I want a guarantee that I won't be fired, laid off, or forced out because of my pregnancy. I want to be treated the same as any other employee. That's what the law requires." "Of course," Diane said quickly. "Of course you'll be treated fairly. This was all just a misunderstanding. Greg was expressing concerns, not making threats. He told me to resign. He offered me severance to leave. That's not expressing concerns. That's constructive discharge." "We'll speak to Greg," Patrick said. "Make sure he understands that any concerns about your pregnancy are unfounded. You'll continue in your position with no issues." "I want that in writing," I said. They agreed to put it in writing. I left that meeting thinking maybe, just maybe, this would work out. I was naive. For the next 2 weeks, things seemed okay on the surface. Greg was coldly professional with me, but didn't bring up my pregnancy. I continued doing my work, hitting my targets, managing my clients. Then the little things started. I was removed from the Johnson account, the big project I'd been leading. Greg said they were redistributing workload and gave it to Derek, a colleague with less experience than me. I was excluded from a client pitch meeting I'd prepared for. Greg said they didn't need my input after all, and sent 2 junior team members instead. My access to certain shared drives and systems was restricted. IT said it was a security update, but somehow I was the only one affected. I was left off email chains about projects I was supposed to be working on. When I asked about it, I was told it was an oversight. Little by little, I was being iced out. They were building a case that I wasn't performing, that I wasn't engaged, that I wasn't essential. I documented everything. Every meeting I was excluded from, every project I was removed from, every weird IT issue. I took screenshots, saved emails, kept detailed notes with dates and times. I also started talking to other women at the company. Quietly, carefully, I asked about their experiences. That's when I found out I wasn't alone. Shauna, my coworker who'd warned me about women not advancing, told me she'd been passed over for a director position 3 times. Each time, the job went to a man with fewer qualifications. When she asked for feedback on how to improve her chances, she was told she didn't have leadership presence, which she believed was code for being a woman. Another coworker, Michelle, told me she'd asked for a raise after taking on additional responsibilities when a teammate left. She was told there wasn't budget for raises. 3 months later, they hired a man to do the same work she'd been doing at a salary 20% higher than hers. A woman named Tara from accounting said she was told she wasn't a cultural fit when she'd declined to participate in company happy hours because she had to pick up her kids from daycare. Her male colleagues who skipped happy hours for gym time or sports leagues faced no similar criticism. The more I talked to women at the company, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't just about pregnancy discrimination. This was systemic gender discrimination across the entire company. Women were paid less than men for the same work. Women were passed over for promotions. Women with children were treated as less committed. Women who asserted themselves were seen as difficult. And pregnant women? They were just pushed out entirely. 3 weeks after I'd filed my complaint with HR, Greg called me into his office. "We're eliminating your position," he said without preamble. "Company restructuring. Your last day will be Friday." My heart sank, but I wasn't surprised. "This is retaliation," I said. "This is a business decision. Your position is being eliminated. That's not illegal." It is if it's in retaliation for filing a discrimination complaint, which is exactly what this is. You can believe whatever you want, but the decision is final. You'll receive 2 weeks severance. HR will handle the paperwork. I stood up. "You're making a huge mistake." "I don't think so. I think we're cutting our losses before this becomes a bigger problem." I walked out of his office, went to my desk, and immediately called an employment attorney I'd been consulting with quietly over the past few weeks. His name was Bernard, and he specialized in workplace discrimination cases. I'd sent him all my recordings and documentation after my first meeting with HR, just to have a legal expert review everything. I told him they just fired me 3 weeks after I filed a discrimination complaint. They're calling it a restructuring. He said, "Perfect. That's retaliation. That's another violation on top of the pregnancy discrimination. We have an incredibly strong case." I said, "What do I do now?" He said, "You file a charge with the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They investigate discrimination complaints. With your evidence, this should be straightforward." That day, I filed a charge of discrimination with the EEOC. I provided them with everything: the recordings, the transcripts, the documentation of being iced out, the timeline of my termination right after filing a complaint.
I also sent them something else: a list of the 4 other women who'd been fired after getting pregnant, plus contact information for several other women at the company who'd experienced gender discrimination. The EEOC investigation started immediately. Because I had such strong evidence, they fast-tracked the case. 2 weeks later, an EEOC investigator showed up at the company unannounced. They interviewed Greg, Diane, Patrick, and several other executives. They requested personnel files, salary data, promotion records, and termination documentation for the past 5 years. That's when the company realized they had a serious problem. The investigator found exactly what I'd suspected. There was a clear pattern of discrimination. Women were paid an average of 18% less than men in equivalent positions. Women comprised 52% of entry-level employees, but only 15% of leadership. 87% of employees terminated for performance in the past 3 years were women. Every single woman who'd gotten pregnant in the past 5 years had either quit or been fired before taking maternity leave. Multiple women had filed internal complaints about discrimination that HR had dismissed or ignored. The EEOC investigator issued what's called a determination letter, basically a finding that there was reasonable cause to believe the company had engaged in illegal discrimination. That letter opened the door for a lawsuit. Bernard filed suit in federal court against the company, Greg personally, and several other executives. We sued for pregnancy discrimination, retaliation, hostile work environment, and violation of the Equal Pay Act. The case got picked up by local media pretty quickly. "Marketing firm faces discrimination lawsuit after firing pregnant employee" was the headline. The story included details about the recordings and the pattern of pushing out pregnant women. That's when other women started coming forward. Not just women from the company, but women from the entire industry who'd experienced similar treatment at other companies. My case became a rallying point. Within a month of the lawsuit being filed, 12 other current and former employees joined as plaintiffs. These were women who'd been discriminated against in various ways: passed over for promotions, paid less than male colleagues, fired after having children, sexually harassed, and then retaliated against for reporting it. The case went from being about me to being a class action lawsuit representing years of systematic discrimination at the company. The company tried to fight it at first. They claimed the recordings were inadmissible. They weren't. They claimed my firing was legitimate business necessity. It wasn't. They claimed they had no idea about any pattern of discrimination. The EEOC data proved otherwise. But as the discovery process continued and more evidence came out, their position became indefensible. Internal emails showed executives joking about not hiring breeders, women of childbearing age. Performance reviews revealed blatantly sexist language,
Women described as too emotional or not assertive enough or not leadership material for behavior that was praised in male colleagues. Salary data showed massive pay gaps, even after accounting for experience and position. A male marketing strategist with the same title and tenure as me made $27,000 more per year. Most damning of all, there were emails from Greg to other executives explicitly discussing strategies to phase out pregnant employees before they could go on maternity leave, specifically to avoid paying benefits and having to hold positions open. The evidence was overwhelming. The company had been systematically discriminating against women for years, and they'd been stupid enough to document it.
6 months into the lawsuit, the company's insurance company, which was covering their legal fees, pressured them to settle. The company was hemorrhaging money on legal costs. They'd lost several major clients who didn't want to be associated with the discrimination scandal, and employee morale had tanked. The settlement negotiations took another 3 months. Bernard fought for every dollar we could get. The final settlement was $8.2 million, split among all 13 plaintiffs. As the lead plaintiff, with the most documented evidence, my portion was $2.3 million. But the settlement wasn't just about money. It included major structural changes to the company. Greg was fired and banned from ever working for the company again. 2 other executives who'd participated in the discrimination were also terminated. Diane in HR was demoted and required to complete extensive training. The company had to hire an independent consultant to review all HR policies and procedures. They had to implement mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees. They had to conduct annual salary audits to identify and correct pay disparities. They had to establish clear promotion criteria and track gender representation in leadership. They had to create an independent reporting system for discrimination complaints that bypassed company HR. Essentially, we forced them to completely overhaul their culture and practices. The settlement was finalized in month 8 of my pregnancy. I was huge and exhausted and so ready to be done with all of it. When Bernard called to tell me the settlement had been approved, I cried. Not just because of the money, though that was life-changing, but because we'd actually won. We'd proven that what happened to me and to all those other women was wrong and illegal and wouldn't be tolerated. I gave birth to my daughter, Harper, 6 weeks later. Owen took paternity leave from his job, and we spent those first few months just being a family. I didn't have to worry about going back to work or scrambling to find a new job. We had financial security for the first time in our lives. The other women from the lawsuit stayed in touch. We'd formed this bond through the whole process. Some of them had stayed at the company, under the new management and policies. Others had left for better opportunities. All of them said participating in the lawsuit was one of the hardest and best things they'd ever done. Shauna, my former coworker, told me that after the settlement, she was finally promoted to director, a position she'd been qualified for years ago. Michelle got a raise that brought her salary in line with her male colleagues. Tara switched to a different department and said the culture had actually improved significantly. The lawsuit sent ripples through our entire industry. Other companies started reviewing their own practices, terrified of being the next one to face a major discrimination lawsuit. Several firms proactively conducted salary audits and adjusted pay disparities before lawsuits could materialize. Greg tried to get another executive position at a different company. When they Googled his name, the first page of results was all articles about the discrimination lawsuit. He didn't get the job. Last I heard, he was working in sales somewhere, no longer in management. That felt like justice. About a year after the settlement, I got a LinkedIn message from a woman I didn't know. She said she'd read about my case and it had given her the courage to report discrimination at her own company. She just wanted to thank me for speaking up. I got messages like that every few weeks, women who'd experienced similar situations and felt less alone knowing someone had fought back and won. That meant more to me than the settlement money. I eventually went back to work part-time, consulting for small businesses who couldn't afford big marketing firms. I set my own hours, worked from home, and was there for Harper while also using my skills and experience.
Owen and I paid off our mortgage with the settlement money. We set up a college fund for Harper. We invested the rest. The financial security changed our lives in ways I couldn't have imagined. But more than that, the whole experience changed how I saw myself. I'd spent so long being afraid to make waves, afraid to be difficult, afraid to stand up for myself because I needed my job. Going through the lawsuit taught me that sometimes you have to make waves. Sometimes being difficult is necessary. Sometimes the risk of speaking up is worth it, even when you're scared. I think about those 4 women who were fired before me: Jessica, Amanda, Rochelle, Kennedy. They were pushed out and didn't fight back because they were scared and didn't think they had options. I almost didn't fight back either. If I hadn't started recording those meetings, if I hadn't documented everything, if I hadn't been willing to file that EEOC charge, I would have just been the 5th pregnant woman pushed out of the company. Instead, I was the one who finally said, enough. My advice to anyone experiencing discrimination at work: document everything. Keep detailed notes with dates and times. Save emails. In one-party consent states, record conversations. Take your evidence to an employment attorney before you do anything else. And know that the law is on your side. Pregnancy discrimination is illegal. Gender discrimination is illegal. Retaliation for reporting discrimination is illegal. Companies count on employees not knowing their rights and being too scared to fight back. Don't be too scared. I was terrified through the whole process, terrified of losing my job, terrified of the lawsuit, terrified that we'd lose and I'd burned all those bridges for nothing. But we didn't lose. We won because the evidence was clear and the law was on our side. Harper is 2 years old now. She's smart and funny and has no idea that she was at the center of a major discrimination lawsuit before she was even born. Someday I'll tell her this story. I'll tell her that when people tried to push her mom out for being pregnant, her mom fought back. I'll tell her that sometimes doing the right thing is scary and hard and risky, but you do it anyway. I'll tell her that she's worth fighting for, that I'm worth fighting for, that all those other women were worth fighting for. And I'll tell her that she should never let anyone make her feel small or less than because of who she is. That's the real victory, I think. Not the settlement money or the policy changes, or even taking down Greg and the others who enabled the discrimination. The real victory is knowing I stood up for myself and for every woman who came before me and every woman who'll come after me. That's something no one can take away.